The aroma hit Commander Sarah Chen like a physical force as she stepped off the transport vessel, nearly buckling her knees. It wasn't the sterile processed nutrition tablet she'd grown accustomed to during the 3-month journey to Kepler Station. This was something else entirely, rich, complex, alive with layers of scent that seemed to dance through the recycled air of the docking bay. Her stomach, which had been quietly protesting the bland sustenance of space travel, suddenly roared to life with a hunger so fierce it surprised her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Around her, the other members of humanity's first culinary exchange program were having similar reactions. Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez actually stumbled, catching himself against the transport's hull as his eyes widened. Chef Isabella Martinez, the program's lead instructor, stood frozen in the doorway, her nostrils flaring as she tried to process what she was experiencing. The Zenthari delegation waiting to greet them seemed oblivious to the humans' reactions. The tall, crystalline beings shimmered in the artificial light, their translucent bodies refracting colors that had no names in human language. Their leader, someone the translation matrix identified as High Curator Vex'thalan, stepped forward with movements that flowed like liquid mercury. "Welcome, primitive ones, to Kepler Station." The High Curator's voice resonated through the universal translator, carrying undertones of what could only be described as barely concealed amusement. "We trust your journey through the void was adequately nourishing with your simple provisions." Sarah bit back her first response. As the military liaison for the exchange program, she'd been briefed extensively on Zenthari culture. They were one of the most advanced civilizations in the known galaxy, having achieved interstellar travel when humans were still discovering fire. Their technology was so sophisticated it bordered on the incomprehensible, and their cuisine was legendary throughout dozens of star systems. The irony wasn't lost on her that Earth had been invited to participate in the Galactic Culinary Symposium at all. When the invitation had arrived through diplomatic channels, half the Earth Council had assumed it was some kind of elaborate joke. Humans cooking for aliens whose technology could literally restructure matter at the molecular level. It seemed absurd. Yet here they were, representing not just Earth, but the entire concept that primitive species might have something worthwhile to contribute to galactic culture. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on Sarah's shoulders as she straightened her uniform and extended her hand in the human gesture of greeting. "High Curator Vex'thalan," she said, careful to pronounce the alien name correctly. "We're honored by this opportunity to share our culinary traditions with the Galactic Culinary Council." The Zenthari's form flickered with what the cultural briefings had identified as their equivalent of laughter. It was a sound like wind chimes made of starlight, beautiful and cutting at the same time. "Traditions, yes. We have studied your food preparation methods with great interest. The application of direct thermal energy to organic compounds, the crude combination of plant and animal matter. Quite rustic." Sarah felt the familiar heat of embarrassment crawl up her neck, but she kept her expression neutral. Beside her, Chef Martinez stepped forward, and Sarah could see the professional pride warring with diplomatic necessity in the older woman's eyes. "We're eager to learn from the galaxy's finest culinary artists," Isabella said, her voice steady, despite the slight tension Sarah could detect. "And we hope our own humble offerings might provide some small entertainment." "Entertainment indeed," High Curator Vex'thalan replied, the harmonics of the translator making it impossible to miss the condescension. "The preliminary scans of your food samples were most illuminating. The molecular structures are fascinatingly chaotic. No doubt there will be much amusement when the other delegates experience your attempts at nourishment." The word "attempts" hung in the recycled air like a challenge. Sarah watched as Marcus's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists before he forced them to relax. She couldn't blame him. The man had trained at some of Earth's finest culinary institutes, had spent years perfecting techniques that went back generations. To hear his life's work dismissed as mere, quote, attempts had to sting. But this was exactly what they'd been warned about. The galaxy's established civilizations had welcomed humanity into the broader interstellar community with a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled superiority. Earth was the newcomer, the upstart species that had barely figured out how to leave their own solar system. They were tolerated, even protected to some degree, but respected? That remained to be seen. The Zenthari delegation began moving deeper into the station, their crystalline forms gliding across the deck plating with unnatural grace. Sarah and her team fell into step behind them, trying not to gawk at the impossible architecture surrounding them. Kepler Station was a marvel of engineering that defied several laws of physics that humans still considered immutable. Corridors seemed to stretch and contract based on the number of people passing through them. Walls displayed patterns that shifted and flowed like living things, responding to the biorhythms of nearby occupants. Your quarters have been prepared in Section Gamma, High Curator Vex'thalan continued as they walked. We felt it appropriate to house your delegation in the area typically reserved for developing species. The environmental controls have been adjusted to accommodate your relatively primitive physiological requirements. That's very considerate, Sarah replied, biting back several less diplomatic responses. The symposium begins in 3 standard cycles. You will have access to one of the smaller food preparation facilities. We thought it best to limit the potential for incidents. The other delegates will be most curious to observe your techniques. They passed through what appeared to be a bustling marketplace, though the goods on display defied easy categorization. Beings from a dozen different species moved through the space, their forms as varied as the contents of the stalls. Sarah caught glimpses of foods that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, beverages that changed color and consistency as she watched, and delicacies that appeared to be composed entirely of crystallized light. A group of vorhec traders, insectoid beings with iridescent carapaces, paused in their negotiations to stare at the human delegation. Their compound eyes tracked the newcomers with barely disguised curiosity, and Sarah heard the chittering sounds of their native language rise in pitch. Even without translation, the tone was unmistakable: amusement. The news of your participation has spread throughout the station, High Curator Vex'thalan noted, apparently unaware of or unconcerned by the growing attention they were attracting. Many species have expressed interest in experiencing human cuisine. The betting pools have been quite active. Betting pools? Marcus asked, speaking for the first time since boarding the transport. Oh yes, the Chronari have established odds on various outcomes. Whether your food will be edible to non-human physiology, whether it will cause digestive distress, whether it might actually prove toxic to certain species. The High Curator's form flickered again with that chiming laughter. The most popular wager appears to be on how quickly your delegation will withdraw from the competition once you observe true galactic cuisine. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach, and it wasn't hunger anymore. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They weren't just representing humanity's culinary traditions. They were here as entertainment, a sideshow for the amusement of species that had been perfecting their crafts for millennia, while humans were still learning to control fire. The realization should have been crushing, but instead, Sarah found herself getting angry. Not the hot, reactive anger that led to poor decisions, but the cold, calculating fury that had served her well during her military career. These aliens thought humans were primitive? They found human cuisine amusing? She was looking forward to proving them wrong. They were shown to their quarters in Section Gamma, and Sarah had to admit the accommodations were comfortable, if clearly designed for species considered junior members of the galactic community. The rooms were smaller than those she'd glimpsed in other sections, the technology more basic, the amenities more limited. It was subtle, but the message was clear: know your place. The food preparation area they'd been assigned was equally telling. While they'd been promised access to a kitchen facility, what they found was clearly a backup space, probably used for emergency meal preparation or training exercises. The equipment was functional but basic, nothing like the sophisticated molecular gastronomy laboratories they'd observed other delegates using. Well, Isabella said as she surveyed their assigned workspace, her voice carefully neutral. It's not what we're used to, but we can work with this. Sarah watched the chef move through the space, cataloging the available equipment with professional efficiency. Isabella Martinez was in her 50s, her dark hair streaked with silver, her hands bearing the calluses and scars of decades spent in professional kitchens. She'd volunteered for this mission knowing full well that failure would reflect not just on her personally, but on every human chef who might follow. "What do you think?" Sarah asked quietly. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, running her fingers along the surface of what appeared to be a heating element. "I think they're expecting us to fail," she said finally. "The question is whether we're going to give them the satisfaction." Marcus joined them, his expression grim. "Did you see the looks we were getting out there? We're not delegates to these people. We're a circus act." "Maybe," Sarah replied. "But circuses sometimes surprise their audiences." Over the next few hours, they settled into their quarters and began the process of acclimating to life aboard Kepler Station. The artificial gravity was slightly heavier than Earth standard, and the atmospheric composition, while breathable, had a metallic taste that took some getting used to. The station operated on a 30-hour cycle that played havoc with their circadian rhythms, and the constant background hum of incomprehensible technology made it difficult to relax. But it was the food that proved to be the most challenging adjustment. Their first meal in the station's main dining facility was an education in just how outclassed they were. Sarah stood in line with her tray, watching as other diners selected from options that seemed to exist in a realm beyond her understanding. A Vorthak trader selected what appeared to be a writhing mass of luminescent tentacles that organized themselves into geometric patterns as she watched. A group of Zenthari were sharing something that looked like crystallized music, the substance chiming softly as they consumed it. When Sarah reached the serving area, she was presented with options that the translation matrix could barely process. Terms like quantum-entangled nutrients and probability-based flavor profiles meant nothing to her. She selected something that the server identified as basic sustenance for developing species, and received what looked like a gray cube that hummed softly. Back at their table, the three humans stared at their meals with barely concealed dismay. The cubes were nutritionally complete, the server had assured them, containing all the minerals and vitamins their primitive physiology required. But they tasted like nothing Sarah could name. Not bland, exactly, but somehow absent of flavor in a way that was almost offensive. "This is what they think food should be," Isabella muttered, poking at her cube with a utensil that appeared to be made of crystallized light. "Perfect nutrition, optimal efficiency, complete absence of soul. Is it wrong that I'm actually homesick for MREs right now?" Marcus asked, trying to chew something that had the consistency of foam but the density of lead. Sarah forced herself to swallow another bite. Around them, the dining hall buzzed with conversation in a dozen languages. The sound filtered through universal translators into a constant murmur of barely comprehensible fragments. She caught references to the upcoming symposium, speculation about various delegates' preparations, and more than a few mentions of the, quote, primitive Earth delegation that invariably drew laughter. "You know what?" Sarah said, setting down her utensil with more force than necessary. "I'm starting to look forward to cooking for these people." "Sarah," Isabella warned, recognizing the tone. "No, I'm serious. Look around this place. Look at what they call food. It's like they've optimized all the joy out of eating. When was the last time you saw anyone in here actually enjoying their meal?" Now that she mentioned it, Marcus realized she was right. The other diners consumed their food with mechanical efficiency, like they were refueling rather than eating. There was no lingering over flavors, no sharing of particularly good dishes, no conversation about the meal itself. It was all function, no form. "They think we're primitive because our food isn't engineered at the molecular level," Sarah continued, her voice gaining intensity. "But when was the last time any of them had a meal that made them close their eyes and sigh with contentment? When did any of them last have food that brought back memories of home or family or celebration?" Isabella's expression was shifting from cautionary to thoughtful. "You might have a point. In all the research we did on galactic cuisine, everything focused on technical achievement, nutritional optimization, efficiency of consumption. Nothing about the experience of eating." "Exactly. They've turned food into fuel, and they think that makes them superior." Sarah looked around the dining hall with new eyes. "But I've seen the way they react to the smells from our transport. There's something missing in their perfect optimized cuisine, and part of them knows it." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another diner, a being Sarah didn't recognize from her briefings. It was roughly humanoid in shape, but covered in what appeared to be metallic scales that shifted color as it moved. Its eyes were large and multifaceted, and when it spoke, the translation matrix identified it as belonging to a species called the Thekmori. "Forgive the intrusion," the being said, its voice carrying harmonics that suggested great age. "I am Scholar Kethvar of the Thekmori Analytical Consortium. I could not help but observe your reactions to standard station nutrition. Sarah tensed, expecting another round of condescension, but something in the being's manner suggested genuine curiosity rather than mockery. "We were just discussing the differences between our respective approaches to nourishment," Isabella replied carefully. Scholar Kethavar's scales shifted to a deeper blue. "Indeed, most fascinating. In my studies of developing species, I have noted that many cultures invest significant emotional and social importance in the consumption of food. This appears to be largely absent from more advanced civilizations." "You say that like it's a bad thing," Marcus said. "On the contrary, I find it intriguing. The Thekmori achieved nutritional optimization approximately 4,000 of your years ago. Our food is precisely calibrated for maximum biological benefit. And yet," the scholar paused, its scales flickering through several colors in rapid succession, "I have sometimes wondered if something was lost in that achievement." Sarah leaned forward, suddenly very interested in where this conversation was heading. "What do you mean?" "Historical records from our pre-optimization period contain numerous references to food-related experiences that have no contemporary equivalent. Concepts that translate roughly as comfort eating and soul satisfaction appear frequently in ancient texts. These concepts became obsolete once we achieved perfect nutrition, but lately I have wondered if their absence might represent a form of cultural impoverishment." The three humans exchanged glances. This was the first time since arriving at Kepler Station that any alien had suggested that human approaches to anything might have merit. "Would you be interested in observing our food preparation techniques?" Isabella asked. "We'll be demonstrating them at the symposium, but we could arrange a private viewing if you're curious." Scholar Kethavar's scales brightened noticeably. "That would be most educational. I have reviewed the available data on human cuisine, but I confess that much of it appears to be focused on techniques rather than outcomes. The emotional and social components are poorly documented." "That's because they can't be documented," Sarah said. "They have to be experienced." The scholar's multifaceted eyes seemed to focus more intently on her. "Experienced. Yes, that is precisely what I suspected. Your species appears to view food consumption as something more than mere biological maintenance." "Food is culture," Isabella said simply. "It's history, it's family, it's celebration and comfort and sometimes even rebellion. You can't separate human cuisine from human experience because they're the same thing." For a long moment, Scholar Kethavar was silent, its scales cycling through colors that Sarah suspected indicated deep thought. Finally, it spoke again. "I have a proposal that may be of mutual benefit. I am preparing a research paper on the sociological implications of nutritional optimization among advanced species. Your perspective on pre-optimization food culture would be invaluable to my work. In exchange, I could provide you with insights into the expectations and biases of the other symposium delegates." Sarah felt the first spark of genuine hope since arriving at the station. An ally, even one motivated primarily by academic curiosity, could make all the difference in their chances of success. "What kind of insights?" she asked. "The other species have certain preconceptions about primitive cultures. They expect your food to be crude, possibly dangerous, certainly inferior to their own refined cuisine. They are attending your demonstration not to be impressed, but to be entertained by your limitations." "We'd gathered that much," Marcus said dryly. "However," Scholar Kethavar continued, "they are also intensely curious about phenomena they cannot understand or replicate. If your cuisine can produce experiences that their optimized nutrition cannot, experiences that their own historical records suggest they may have lost, then their mockery could very quickly turn to something else entirely." "Such as?" Isabella asked. The scholar's scales shifted to a deep gold. "Hunger." The conversation with Scholar Kethavar stretched late into the station's artificial night cycle. The Thekmori proved to be a wealth of information about galactic politics, cultural expectations, and the complex social dynamics that governed interactions between species of vastly different technological capabilities. More importantly, the scholar seemed genuinely intrigued by human approaches to food and culture in ways that went beyond mere academic curiosity. Sarah found herself relaxing for the first time since their arrival. Here was someone who didn't automatically dismiss human methods as primitive, who seemed to understand that technological advancement and cultural sophistication weren't necessarily the same thing. It was a refreshing change from the barely concealed contempt they'd encountered from most other species. The key thing to understand, Scholar Kethvar explained as they sat in a quiet corner of the dining hall, is that most advanced species view food as they view any other technology, something to be optimized for maximum efficiency. The concept that the process of consumption might be as important as the nutritional outcome is foreign to them. Isabella nodded thoughtfully. So when we talk about comfort food, or the way certain dishes can evoke memories or emotions, they literally can't understand what we mean? Precisely. Their languages don't even have equivalent concepts. When I try to translate your phrase comfort food into Zenthari, the closest approximation comes out as something like suboptimal nutrition with psychological dependencies. You can imagine how that sounds to them. Marcus laughed, but there was little humor in it. So we're not just competing against their cuisine, we're competing against their entire worldview. In a sense, yes. But that may also be your greatest advantage. The scholar's scales shifted to a pattern Sarah was beginning to recognize as excitement. They cannot conceive of food as anything other than fuel. If you can demonstrate that human cuisine offers something their optimized nutrition cannot, if you can make them feel what they've lost in their pursuit of efficiency, then you will have accomplished something truly remarkable. Assuming we can actually cook anything edible with the limited equipment they've given us, Isabella said with a sigh. Ah, yes, the kitchen facilities. Scholar Kethvar's scales darkened slightly. I suspect that was intentionally limiting. They want to ensure that your inevitable failure can be attributed to human limitations rather than inadequate resources. Sarah felt that cold anger building again, meaning they're setting us up to fail. Setting you up to confirm their existing biases? Yes. The difference is significant. If you can succeed despite the limitations they've imposed, it will be impossible for them to dismiss your achievements. The next day brought Sarah's first real look at what they were up against. The symposium's opening ceremony was held in the station's main auditorium, a vast space that seemed to exist in more dimensions than Sarah's brain could comfortably process. Delegates from 37 different species had gathered to showcase their culinary traditions, and the diversity on display was both awe-inspiring and deeply intimidating. The Zenthari delegation had constructed what appeared to be a molecular gastronomy laboratory that existed partially outside normal space-time. Their lead chef, though Sarah wasn't sure chef was the right term for a being that seemed to manipulate matter at the quantum level, demonstrated the creation of a dish that existed simultaneously in multiple states of being until the moment of consumption. The Vorthak delegation's presentation focused on what they called evolutionary cuisine, foods that literally evolved during the eating process, adapting to the consumer's taste preferences in real time. Watching a piece of what looked like raw meat transform itself into something resembling crystallized honey while being consumed was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. But it was the demonstration by the Chronari Empire that really drove home the scale of what they were facing. The Chronari had apparently been perfecting their cuisine for over 10,000 years, and their presentation was less cooking than performance art. Their chef conducted an orchestra of automated systems that prepared a meal Sarah couldn't even properly see. The dish existed primarily in spectrums beyond human vision, its flavors accessible only to beings with sensory organs humans had never evolved. Feeling discouraged yet? Scholar Kethvar asked, appearing beside them with the silent grace characteristic of the Thekmori. Completely outclassed is more like it, Marcus admitted. How are we supposed to compete with that? Our most advanced cooking technique involves applying controlled heat to ingredients. Your most obvious cooking technique, perhaps. But I suspect your actual techniques go far deeper than simple thermal application. The scholar's scale shifted to a thoughtful blue-green. Tell me, what is the most important element in human cuisine? Isabella considered the question carefully. That depends on who you ask. Some would say technique, others would say ingredients. Personally, I think it's understanding. Knowing not just how to prepare food, but why you're preparing it that way, and for whom. Understanding. Yes, that is what I suspected. Scholar Kethavar's scales brightened. None of the demonstrations we just witnessed showed any understanding of their audience beyond basic biological compatibility. They were performances of technical mastery, nothing more. Sarah was beginning to see where the scholar was heading. You're saying they're cooking for themselves, not for the people who will eat their food. Exactly. They are solving technical challenges, proving theoretical points, demonstrating technological superiority. But they are not attempting to create experiences for their consumers. And you think that's something we can do that they can't? Marcus asked. I think it's something they've forgotten how to do. The question is whether you can remind them. That afternoon, Sarah, Isabella, and Marcus returned to their assigned kitchen space with new purpose. The facility was still limited, the equipment still basic by galactic standards, but Sarah was beginning to see it differently. Instead of focusing on what they couldn't do, maybe they needed to focus on what they could do that no one else was doing. All right, Isabella said, surveying their workspace with fresh eyes. Let's talk about what we actually want to accomplish here. We're not going to out-technology the other delegates. That's not even a possibility. But what can we do that they can't? Sarah thought about the conversations she'd had with scholar Zenthari about the missing emotional and social components of advanced cuisine. We can make them feel something. Feel something how? Think about it. When was the last time you had a meal that made you homesick? Or reminded you of your childhood? Or made you feel like you were celebrating something important? Marcus's expression was shifting from skeptical to interested. You're talking about comfort food. Nostalgia. Food that means something beyond just nutrition. Exactly. But more than that, food that creates experiences, that brings people together, that makes them slow down and actually pay attention to what they're eating. Isabella was nodding slowly. It's not about the complexity of the dishes we prepare. It's about the simplicity of the experience we create. They spent the next several hours planning their approach, and for the first time since arriving at Kepler Station, Sarah felt genuinely optimistic about their chances. They weren't going to try to compete on technical complexity. That was a losing game from the start. Instead, they were going to offer something that had been missing from galactic cuisine for so long that most species had forgotten it existed. The simple pleasure of a shared meal. The plan they developed was ambitious in its simplicity. Rather than preparing elaborate individual dishes for the judging panel, they would create a communal dining experience. They would cook simple, traditional human foods: bread, soup, roasted vegetables, basic proteins prepared with care and attention to flavor rather than technological innovation. And they would serve it family style, encouraging the alien delegates to sit together, share food, and actually talk to each other during the meal. It's either going to be brilliant or a complete disaster, Marcus observed as they finalized their preparations. Those aren't mutually exclusive possibilities, Isabella replied with a grin that reminded Sarah why she'd been chosen to lead this mission. The evening before their scheduled presentation, Sarah found herself unable to sleep. The artificial day-night cycle aboard the station was still playing havoc with her circadian rhythms, but more than that, she was nervous in a way she hadn't been since her first combat deployment. Tomorrow would determine not just their personal success or failure, but potentially the way humanity was viewed by the broader galactic community for generations to come. She made her way to one of the station's observation decks, a vast transparent dome that provided an unobstructed view of the cosmos beyond. The stars here looked different than they did from Earth. Brighter, more numerous, arranged in patterns that reminded her how far from home they really were. Unable to rest as well, Scholar Zenthari's voice came from behind her, the being's approach silent as always. Too much nervous energy, Sarah admitted. Tomorrow's a big day. Indeed. I have been monitoring the communication channels, and there is considerable anticipation surrounding your presentation. The betting pools have grown quite substantial. Sarah turned to face the scholar. Still expecting us to fail spectacularly? The odds remain against you, yes. But I find myself hoping that the majority will be proven wrong. The scholar's scales shifted to a warm golden hue. I have been reviewing historical records from various species' pre-optimization periods, and I have found some fascinating parallels to your current approaches to cuisine. Such as? The Zenthari, before they achieved molecular gastronomy, had traditions around what they called harmony meals, communal eating experiences designed to strengthen social bonds. The Vorthak once had elaborate food-sharing rituals that were central to their cultural identity. Even my own people had concepts of memory foods that were prepared specifically to evoke emotional responses. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the observation deck's temperature. They all gave that up? Gradually, yes, as their technology advanced. As their nutrition became more efficient, the social and emotional aspects of eating were seen as unnecessary complications, primitive holdovers from less enlightened times. The scholar's scales darkened. I am beginning to suspect that this was a mistake. What makes you think that? Scholar Kethavar was quiet for a long moment, apparently considering how to phrase the response. Have you noticed how little genuine interaction there is between species aboard this station? Oh, we conduct business, we exchange information, we maintain diplomatic relations, but we do not connect. We exist in parallel rather than together. Sarah realized the scholar was right. Despite being surrounded by representatives of dozens of different civilizations, the station felt oddly lonely. Everyone was polite, professional, efficient, but there was no real warmth, no sense of community. You think food might be part of that? I think the loss of shared eating experiences may have been more significant than anyone realized at the time. Food was the original social glue for most species. It brought individuals together, created bonds, established trust. When we optimize that away, we may have optimized away something essential to social cohesion. The implications of what Scholar Kethavar was suggesting hit Sarah like a physical blow. If the scholar was right, if the loss of communal dining experiences had contributed to the isolation between species, then tomorrow's presentation was about more than just proving human cuisine had value. It was about demonstrating something the galaxy had forgotten it needed. No pressure then, she said with dark humor. On the contrary, I believe the pressure may be exactly what is needed. Sometimes it takes an outside perspective to recognize what has been lost. The scholar's scales brightened again. Your species' approach to food preparation and consumption may offer other species an opportunity to reconnect with aspects of their own cultures they have forgotten. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars wheel slowly past the observation dome. Finally, Scholar Kethavar spoke again. I have taken the liberty of making certain adjustments to tomorrow's presentation schedule. Sarah turned to stare at the being. What kind of adjustments? I convinced the symposium organizers to extend your presentation time and to modify the judging format. Instead of the standard individual evaluation process, your dishes will be served as part of a communal meal. All delegates will eat together, family style as you put it. You did what? Sarah's voice cracked with surprise. I argued that human cuisine cannot be properly evaluated outside its cultural context, that the social aspects are integral to the experience. The organizers found this academically interesting and agreed to the modification. Sarah didn't know whether to thank the scholar or panic. The plan they developed had been based on the assumption that they'd be serving a small panel of judges. Now they'd be cooking for dozens of delegates from species they barely understood, with dietary requirements they could only guess at. Scholar Kethavar, she said carefully, what you've done is either the most helpful thing anyone has ever done for us, or you've just guaranteed our complete humiliation in front of the entire galactic community. The being's scales shifted through several rapid color changes that Sarah interpreted as the Thekmori equivalent of laughter. As your Lieutenant Rodriguez observed earlier, those possibilities are not mutually exclusive. Sarah couldn't help but laugh at that. You've been paying attention to our conversations. I find your species endlessly fascinating. The way you face uncertainty with humor, the way you support each other through difficulty, the way you find hope in seemingly impossible situations. These are traits that have become increasingly rare among advanced civilizations. Maybe because advanced civilizations don't face as much uncertainty and difficulty? Perhaps. Or perhaps those experiences are more important to psychological and social development than we have assumed. The scholar's voice carried a note of something that might have been sadness. The price of optimization may have been higher than we realized. As Sarah made her way back to her quarters, her mind was racing. Tomorrow's presentation had just become infinitely more complicated, but also potentially more meaningful. If they could create the kind of communal dining experience that Scholar Kethavar believed had been lost, if they could remind these advanced species what they had given up in their pursuit of efficiency, then they might accomplish something truly historic. The question was whether three humans with basic cooking equipment and limited ingredients could pull off what might be the most important meal in galactic history. Back in her room, Sarah found Isabella and Marcus still awake, huddled over their tablets as they refined their recipes for the 100th time. She broke the news about Scholar Kethavar's modifications to their presentation format and watched as their expressions shifted from shock to panic to something that might have been excitement. So instead of cooking for a panel of 5 judges, we're now cooking for 40-plus delegates from 37 different species, most of whom are expecting us to fail, Marcus summarized. And we have to do it in a way that creates some kind of transformative communal experience that reminds them of cultural traditions they've forgotten. That's about the size of it, Sarah confirmed. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, staring at her tablet screen. Then she looked up with the kind of smile that had gotten her through 20 years of professional kitchen disasters. "You know what?" she said. "I think I know exactly what we need to cook." Isabella's revelation came at 3 in the morning, station time. She sat bolt upright in her narrow bunk, eyes wide with the kind of clarity that only comes in moments of absolute certainty. She knew exactly what they needed to cook, and, more importantly, she understood why it would work. The answer wasn't in complexity or innovation. It was in the most fundamental human experience of all: hunger. Real hunger. The kind that went beyond mere nutritional need and touched something primal in the soul. She found Sarah and Marcus in the common area, both still wide awake despite the late hour. The weight of tomorrow's presentation hung over them like a physical presence, making sleep impossible. "I've got it," Isabella announced without preamble. "I know what we're going to cook. Please tell me it's something we can actually prepare with our limited equipment," Marcus said, looking up from the ingredient list he'd been obsessing over. "Bread?" Isabella said simply. "Fresh bread, vegetable soup, and roasted root vegetables with herbs. The simplest meal possible." Sarah stared at her. "That's it? That's your grand revelation? Basic peasant food?" "Not peasant food," Isabella corrected, settling into a chair with the kind of calm that comes after finding the right answer. "Survival food. Comfort food. The kind of meal that every human culture has some version of because it speaks to something deeper than taste preferences." Marcus looked skeptical. "Isabella, these beings have technology that can restructure matter at the molecular level. They're going to be expecting something at least marginally impressive." "They're expecting us to fail while trying to impress them," Isabella shot back. "But what if we don't try to impress them at all? What if we just feed them?" She leaned forward, her voice gaining intensity as the idea crystallized. "Think about what scholar Kepler told us. These species have optimized away the experience of eating. They consume perfectly balanced nutrition, but they've forgotten what it feels like to be truly hungry and then satisfied. They've forgotten what it's like to smell bread baking and feel your mouth water. They've forgotten the simple pleasure of hot soup on a cold day." Sarah was beginning to understand. "You want to make them hungry first." "Exactly. Not just nutritionally depleted, but genuinely, deeply hungry in a way they haven't experienced in generations. And then we feed them the most basic, satisfying food imaginable." The plan that emerged over the next hour was audacious in its simplicity. They would start the presentation by sharing stories of human hunger, real accounts of food scarcity, and the profound satisfaction that comes from a simple meal when you truly need it. They would explain how human cuisine had evolved, not from abundance, but from making the most of limited resources, from finding ways to create satisfaction and comfort even in difficult circumstances. And then they would serve a meal that embodied those principles. Bread made from basic grains, kneaded by hand and baked until the entire space filled with its aroma. Soup prepared from simple vegetables, simmered slowly to develop deep, complex flavors through time and patience rather than technological intervention. Root vegetables roasted until they caramelized, their natural sugars concentrated through the ancient alchemy of controlled heat. "It's either brilliant or insane," Marcus admitted as they finalized their approach. "Why not both?" Isabella grinned. "The best cooking usually is." The morning of their presentation arrived with the artificial dawn that marked the beginning of Kepler Station's cycle. Isabella was already in the kitchen, her hands working steadily as she prepared the bread dough. The repetitive motion of kneading was meditative, centering her for what lay ahead. Sarah and Marcus arrived to find the space already transformed. The simple act of bread making had filled the air with yeast and flour and promise. Even with their basic equipment, Isabella had managed to create something that smelled like home. "How are you feeling?" Sarah asked, though Isabella's calm efficiency already provided the answer. "Ready," Isabella replied without looking up from her work. For the first time since we got here, I feel like we're doing something that makes sense. The presentation was scheduled for mid-cycle, when the maximum number of delegates would be available to attend. As the time approached, representatives from 37 species began filing into the modified dining hall. The space had been reconfigured according to scholar Kethavar's specifications, with a single, large table surrounded by seating adapted for various alien physiologies. Sarah watched through the kitchen's viewing window as the delegates took their places. The atmosphere was clearly one of amused anticipation. Conversations in multiple languages created a babble of sound that the universal translators struggled to parse, but the tone was unmistakable. They were here to be entertained by human failure. High Curator Vex'thalan occupied a place of honor at the head of the table, the Zenthari's crystalline form refracting the artificial light into rainbow patterns. Beside them sat the Vorthak trade representative, compound eyes scanning the room with insectoid precision. The Chronari delegation had arranged themselves with military precision, their metallic exoskeletons gleaming under the dining hall's illumination. "Time to make our entrance," Sarah said, checking her uniform one final time. They entered the dining hall together, Sarah leading with military bearing, Isabella and Marcus flanking her with the confident stride of professional chefs approaching their station. The conversations gradually died down as the assembled delegates turned their attention to the human representatives. "Honored delegates," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet space. "Thank you for joining us today. Before we share our food with you, we'd like to share something else, our story." She had rehearsed this opening, but standing before representatives of civilizations that spanned the galaxy, the words took on new weight. Human cuisine didn't develop in laboratories or through technological innovation. It evolved from necessity, from survival, from the simple need to make the most of whatever we had available. Isabella stepped forward. "On our world, food has always been about more than nutrition. It's been about community, about sharing what little we have, about finding comfort and celebration even in difficult times. Our greatest dishes weren't created by master chefs in perfect kitchens. They were created by ordinary people, doing extraordinary things with ordinary ingredients." The delegates listened with polite attention, but Sarah could see the skepticism in their alien features. This wasn't what they'd expected from a culinary presentation. Where were the demonstrations of technical mastery? Where was the molecular gastronomy? Marcus picked up the narrative. "We want to tell you about hunger. Not the simple biological need for nutrition that your perfectly optimized food systems prevent, but real hunger. The kind that makes you grateful for whatever you can get. The kind that makes a simple meal taste like the most wonderful thing in the universe." The Chronari delegation exchanged glances that suggested confusion. The concept of gratitude for suboptimal nutrition was clearly foreign to them. "Today, we're not going to show you advanced cooking techniques or molecular innovations," Sarah continued. "We're going to show you what humans do when we have simple ingredients and the need to feed people we care about. We're going to show you food that satisfies not just the body, but the soul." Isabella moved to the portable oven they'd set up at one end of the dining hall. With practiced efficiency, she removed several loaves of bread, their crusts golden brown and crackling softly as they cooled. The aroma hit the room like a wave, and Sarah watched with satisfaction as several delegates' breathing patterns changed noticeably. The thick Mori scholar's scales shifted to an intense blue-green, and one of the Vorthak representatives made a chittering sound that didn't translate but seemed to indicate surprise. Even High Curator Vex'thalan's form flickered with what might have been uncertainty. "This is bread," Isabella announced, placing the loaves on the table where everyone could see them. "Made from ground grains, water, salt, and living organisms that humans have cultivated for thousands of years. The process hasn't changed much in all that time because it doesn't need to. It's already perfect." She broke one of the loaves open, and steam rose from the soft interior. The sound of the crust crackling was audible throughout the hall, and several delegates leaned forward unconsciously. Marcus emerged from the kitchen carrying a large pot of soup, its surface steaming gently. "This is vegetable soup," he explained as he ladled it into bowls. "Root vegetables, herbs, and water, simmered slowly until the flavors meld together. It's probably the most basic dish in human cuisine, and also one of the most satisfying." The third course was even simpler. Roasted vegetables, their surfaces caramelized and glistening, seasoned with nothing more than salt, pepper, and herbs that filled the air with their fragrance. As the humans placed the food on the table, something remarkable happened. The carefully maintained distance between delegates began to break down. The aroma of fresh bread and herbs seemed to act as a social lubricant, drawing beings together in ways that formal diplomacy had failed to achieve. A Vorthak representative found herself seated next to a Zenthari, their species' traditional rivalry temporarily forgotten in the face of shared curiosity about the food before them. The Chronari military delegation, usually rigidly formal, began asking questions about the cooking process with genuine interest. "Please," Isabella said, taking her seat at the table, "eat." The first tentative tastes were followed by longer pauses as the delegates processed what they were experiencing. The bread, still warm from the oven, had a texture and flavor complexity that their molecular gastronomy couldn't replicate. The soup, despite its simple ingredients, delivered layers of taste that unfolded gradually on the palate. The roasted vegetables offered sweetness and richness that spoke to something primal in their ancient evolutionary memories. But it was more than just the food itself. As the meal progressed, something extraordinary began to happen. Conversation started organically, not the formal diplomatic exchanges typical of interspecies gatherings, but genuine curiosity about each other's experiences with food and culture. The Thekmori scholar was the first to verbalize what many were feeling. "This is remarkable. I have not experienced anything like this since reviewing historical records from our pre-optimization period." "What do you mean?" asked a Chronari officer, pausing with a spoonful of soup halfway to her mouth. "The sensation of satisfaction," Scholar Kethvar replied, searching for words that the translator could properly convey. "Not merely the cessation of hunger, but positive pleasure in the act of eating. And the social component. I find myself wanting to continue this conversation, to share this experience with others." A Vorthak trader made the chittering sound that indicated agreement. "Our ancient texts speak of feast memories, important events centered around shared food. I had always assumed these were primitive social structures. But now I wonder if we lost something important when we optimized them away." High Curator Vex'thalan had been notably quiet throughout the meal, their crystalline form flickering through color patterns that suggested deep thought. Finally, they spoke. "I am experiencing sensations that I do not have words for," the Zenthari admitted. "This food is not optimally nutritious. It is not molecularly perfect. It contains inefficiencies and redundancies that our cuisine eliminated millennia ago. And yet," the High Curator paused, apparently struggling to articulate the experience, "and yet it makes me feel something that our perfect food does not, something that I had thought was simply an artifact of primitive biology, but now suspect may be something else entirely." Sarah watched the table with growing amazement. The formal distance between species was dissolving as delegates shared food and stories, discovered common experiences, and found themselves genuinely enjoying each other's company. The Chronari were laughing at a story the Vorthak delegation was telling. The Zenthari were asking detailed questions about human farming techniques. Even the notoriously aloof Malkarian representative was engaged in animated conversation with a group of traders from the outer systems. Isabella caught Sarah's eye and smiled. They had done it. They had created exactly the kind of communal experience that Scholar Kethvar believed had been lost. More than that, they had reminded these advanced civilizations that optimization wasn't always optimization, that sometimes the things that seemed inefficient were actually the most important things of all. As the meal drew to a close, the formal evaluation that was supposed to determine the human's success or failure seemed almost beside the point. The delegates were reluctant to leave, lingering over the last of their bread and soup, continuing conversations that had nothing to do with cuisine and everything to do with the connections they'd unexpectedly formed. But High Curator Vex'thalan eventually called the gathering to order, their crystalline form brightening as they addressed the assembly. The human delegation was tasked with demonstrating their culinary traditions to this gathering. By any technical measure they have failed. Their food is not molecularly optimized. It does not demonstrate technological advancement. It cannot compete with our sophisticated cuisine on any measurable parameter. Sarah felt her heart sink, but then the High Curator continued. However, they have accomplished something that our advanced cuisine has not achieved in millennia. They have created an experience that transcends mere nutrition. They have reminded us that food can be about more than biological maintenance. It can be about connection, about shared experience, about satisfaction that goes beyond the physical. The Zenthari paused, their form flickering through patterns that suggested strong emotion. The Galactic Culinary Council hereby recognizes human cuisine not as a technical achievement, but as a cultural one. More than that, we formally request that human culinary specialists be assigned to major diplomatic gatherings throughout the galaxy. If food can break down barriers between species as effectively as we have witnessed today, then it may be one of our most powerful tools for building understanding in an increasingly complex universe. The applause that followed was unlike anything Sarah had heard before, a cacophony of alien appreciation that the translators couldn't fully convey, but that needed no translation. They had not just succeeded, they had fundamentally changed how the galaxy thought about food and its role in civilization. Months later, Sarah stood in the same observation deck where she'd had her conversation with Scholar Kethvar, but now she wasn't alone. The scholar stood beside her, their scales a contented gold, along with representatives from a dozen other species who had become regular visitors to what was now known as the Human Cultural Exchange Kitchen. The space had been expanded and properly equipped, and Isabella now led a team of chefs from multiple species who were working together to rediscover the social and cultural aspects of food that had been lost in the pursuit of optimization. The Zenthari had contributed their molecular gastronomy expertise, but they were using it to enhance rather than replace traditional cooking methods. The Vorthak had shared their knowledge of ingredient cultivation, while the Kranari had provided organizational skills that kept the complex operation running smoothly. "You know," Sarah said, watching the stars wheel past the observation dome, "when we first arrived, I thought our biggest challenge would be proving that human cuisine could compete with galactic technology. And instead you proved that competition was the wrong framework entirely," Scholar Kethvar replied. "You showed us that the best cuisine, like the best civilizations, comes from cooperation, from combining different strengths, rather than proving superiority." Through the observation deck's transparent floor, Sarah could see the dining hall below, bustling with activity as beings from across the galaxy shared meals and stories. The formal distance that had characterized interspecies relations for centuries was giving way to something warmer, more genuine, more connected. Isabella emerged from the kitchen, her chef's uniform slightly flour-dusted, her face glowing with the satisfaction of someone who had found her true calling. She joined them at the observation window, following their gaze to the stars beyond. "Any regrets about leaving Earth?" Sarah asked. Isabella smiled. "Are you kidding? We're feeding the galaxy, one meal at a time, teaching species that have forgotten how to be hungry to remember what satisfaction really means. Building bridges between civilizations through something as simple as breaking bread together." She paused, her expression thoughtful. "I can't think of anything I'd rather be doing." Marcus appeared with a plate of something that steamed gently in the artificial atmosphere, offering it to the group. "New recipe," he announced proudly. "Zenthari quantum bread infused with Thekmori memory spices and Vorthak harmony herbs. It's designed to evoke feelings of home and belonging across multiple species simultaneously." Sarah took a bite and felt warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the food. It tasted like Earth somehow, but also like places she'd never been, like homes she'd never known but somehow remembered. "This is it," she said quietly. "This is what we were really trying to create. Not just food, but understanding. Not just meals, but connections." Scholar Kethavar's scales shifted through a pattern that Sarah had learned indicated deep contentment. "My research has confirmed what your demonstration proved, that advanced civilizations need more than technological achievement to truly thrive. They need connection, community, shared experiences that bind them together. You have given us back something we didn't even realize we had lost." As if summoned by their words, High Curator Vex'thalan appeared in the observation deck, their crystalline form more vibrant than Sarah had ever seen it. "The quarterly reports are in," the Zenthari announced without preamble. "Interspecies cooperation is up 67% galaxy-wide since the implementation of human culinary exchange programs. Diplomatic incidents are down by half." Trade agreements are being negotiated faster and with greater mutual satisfaction than ever before. The High Curator paused, their form flickering through colors that suggested amazement. Who would have thought that the key to galactic harmony was something as simple as making sure everyone was well-fed and happy? Sarah laughed, thinking back to her grandmother's kitchen on Earth, to family dinners that stretched late into the evening, to the way food had always brought people together in the most fundamental way possible. "Any human could have told you that," she said. "We just had to remember to ask." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.